Hello friends. In the last episode of Just Return, you might remember that Gus was on the plane looking among the wreckage of the back of the fuselage for Duncan. That's where we take up the story now. Gus looked past the air hostess who may have opened the door, who may have saved their lives, who may have had a good life. There, slumped across the vacant seat beside him, was Duncan. His sandy hair was scorched, but he'd escaped some of the blast. The green eyes stared up at Gus, those hopeful green eyes that Gus had first noticed in the departure lounge before they boarded this flight to eternity. What hope had this Duncan now? Gus noticed Duncan's t-shirt, and he read it. It was in 3 languages, English and German, and he thought maybe Spanish, and it said, "Save the rainforest, save yourself." Oh, the irony of this. An environmentally friendly youth, lying dead among the rainforest foliage, killed by a sky-high polluter, hopes dashed to pieces in moments, human youthful optimism snuffed out by human error. Gus reminded himself why he was here. He wanted to take the body of this poor youth to another place, bury it, mark it, a spot that allowed the girl in his care to go and grieve. He wanted her to remember those hopeful green eyes, not to be left with memories of that horrific stare looking at him now. But how would he get the young man's remains down from the plane? Okay, he was dead, and he was defaced, but he couldn't just drop him down. It seemed important to be some dignity in the removal of the poor man's body. It seemed to matter. Gus undid Duncan's seatbelt and he looked around. He noticed that outside there were those hanging vine-like plants. Some of them had been severed by the actual crash of the plane. There were a number of them. They seemed to grow everywhere. They were like trees that grew up using the other trees for support. But some of them were younger and supple, and he thought he might be able to make use of these. He returned to Duncan, and with difficulty turned him around, and then getting hold under each arm, he dragged the corpse to the opening, and then climbing down from the tree found one of these vine-like plants that had been left hanging from above and several from below. He pulled on one, put all his weight on it. It cut his hand, but it didn't snap. He climbed up into the plane again, scanning the trailing plant between the branches of the tree so that he could reach it from the wreckage. Inside the tail section once more, he emptied Duncan's pockets, feeling strangely guilty and afraid that someone would interpret this as taking booty from the dead. He wanted to explain to any invisible watchers. Then he stopped himself. All these decades without superstition, what was happening to him? He needed the contents of these pockets to give to the girl. He dropped the wallet that Duncan had had in his hip pocket, and it opened to reveal a picture of the girl on a beach somewhere in a swimming costume. Gus shook his head. "Just kids," he muttered, "with all their life in front of them, and it was going to be a life together." Gus hadn't shared his life with anyone, really. He pulled the wallet with the other personal effects in the trouser pockets, and then he attached Duncan's belt to the vines that he'd brought up. It was very rough on Gus's hands. He edged Duncan out of the plane, holding on to the vine as he gave the corpse a final push with his foot. He felt the cutting into his flesh. He was grateful the young man was of moderate build. He lowered him to the ground, feeling oddly like a hangman. There was a strange irony in his thoughts at the fact that things were so bad that there was value in making a rescue of the dead, or at least of this one dead, so that it could benefit one who still lived. As he climbed down the tree, he became aware of the smell of death. He'd forgotten about it, perhaps because of being preoccupied with the mechanics of getting Duncan down from the plane. But how that smell reminded him of experiences in the war. Gus now had to decide where he would give Duncan an honourable burial. He walked from the ruined aircraft back along the familiar ridge. When he reached a fallen tree, he thought it was a good landmark. He was a good 10 minutes from the crash scene, and as he walked beside its fallen trunk, he found a spot that looked as if he could remove enough soil or forest debris to bury the young man. It wouldn't be 6 foot for Duncan, but he would make sure that the young man was well covered. Working with his hands, Gus created a hole and worked at the carpet of debris and the mud beneath until he had some kind of saucer shape 3 feet deep in the middle. The strange call of a bird, a kind of crack-da-dong, amused Gus. He took this as a forest approval of the grave, brushed his hands together and decided he'd better check Belle first. He found the girl still sleeping and all seemed to be okay. He recharged the fire and returned to the corpse. He found Duncan covered in ants, which alarmed him. Would these creatures bite? Then he realised why these creatures were gathering around the left hand of Duncan's body. They were feeding on his flesh. Gus was not easily disgusted, but he was not having this. It seemed the forest floor had no respect for the dead. Everything would have to be quickly utilised and recycled as useful. Gus worked out that he could not accept this until after the burial. The worms and microbes of the English country graveyard seemed slow and respectful, as if it really mattered. And yet to Gus it did. Gus took hold of Duncan's feet and dragged him about 10 yards. Then he took a breath and dragged him again. Sorry, Duncan. This should be a hearse and a man with a top hat, but I can't arrange that. If I was younger, I would carry you. A monkey chattered in a tree not far away. Gus took that as further comment from the forest, and he continued the slow progress, a few yards at a time, and then a rest. The 10-minute walk was a 35-minute drag. It didn't help that at one point Duncan's corpse was hindered by his torso getting tangled in a creeping plant. Gus was hot, breathless and frustrated. He pulled the young man's body down into the grave, and standing silently he looked down at the slightly scorched face. Looking upward, he muttered a simple prayer in his native German language. He threw a handful of earth into the grave. I wish you a safer trip to paradise, Duncan, he said. Then he filled the grave. He wanted flowers but couldn't see any. Strange, because he could smell them. The gloom of the forest didn't help him to locate them, so he picked up a large dead piece of wood, broke 1/3 of it off at the end, and lay a cross on top of the resting place for Duncan. Then he wondered if Duncan or Belle would want a cross. So many young people renounce the ideas of their parents and the values of past generations. Were they Christians at all? What was a Christian anyway? Removing the cross, Gus used the wood instead, along with other forest debris, to make a border around the grave. So, Duncan is laid to rest. God, please remember him. Brushing his hands together and pausing for about a minute in silent thought, Gus now walked away back to the ridge and to the camp, as he called the place where Belle was. Gus was very thirsty, and he knew that the girl would be too, and in need of water. When he got back, she was still sleeping.